Hi AP. Okay, we're going to continue our video. This is part 2 of non-chord tones. I have an example up here which I will play for you that has a review of some non-chord tones that we already discussed in the first video. But before we even talk about that, let's look at the chord progression. We're in the key of E minor, and it looks as if we have a circle progression. 1, 4, 7, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. So we're ending on a perfect authentic cadence as well. As you can see, here is this example. Let's take a listen to it. Here's E minor. So hopefully you heard the passing tones, the neighbor tones, and there's a suspension there in the penultimate measure. Let's take a listen one more time. Here's some more music with some non-chord tones that we already know and some that may be new that we'll study today. Let's take a look at measure 1, where we'll find 2 passing tones. Passing tones move stepwise from a chord tone to a different chord tone. Let's listen to measure 1. Listen again. Clearly the D's are not part of the chord. Those are passing tones. And those are really unaccented passing tones. In measure 2, our first one is abbreviated IN. That's for incomplete neighbor. Notice it's an incomplete neighbor because it's preceded by a rest or by nothing and moves by step to a chord tone. So that's what an incomplete neighbor would look like. And the second one in that measure is just abbreviated N for our neighbor tone, which is stepwise from a chord tone back to the same chord tone. Let's listen to measure 2. Here it is again. So that measure we had an incomplete neighbor and a neighbor. Moving on to measure 3, we find that we have a suspension. Remember that a suspension is repeated or held from the previous chord and then resolves downward by step to a chord tone. The suspension is circled, it's the C. Let's take a listen to measure 3. And we have 2 suspensions here. Listen again. And one final time. In measure 4, we have anticipation. Anticipation is approached stepwise and is then repeated when it resolves. It normally occurs in the soprano, by the way, for anticipation. Let's listen to the 4th measure. So the C of the last chord arrived a bit early. Let's listen again. Anticipations typically happen at cadence points. Okay, this is a perfect authentic cadence. Sol, do in the bass, and soprano ends on do. Let's listen. In example 5, we have the non-chord tone retardation, which is repeated or held from the previous chord and then resolves upward by a step to a chord tone. We also have an appoggiatura in this one at the same time that we have the retardation. So let's take a listen to measure 5. Listen again. And one last time. Do you see that we have the appoggiatura that happens there too? Because remember, appoggiaturas are approached by a leap, most often approached by a leap, and resolve down by step. And if you look carefully, the appoggiatura is on a strong beat. In measure 6, we have something new to discuss. We have the pedal tone. That's a type of non-chord tone. The pedal tone is repeating, usually in the bass, and normally changes between harmonic and non-harmonic. So in measure 6, for example, we have the C that's in the bass, that's harmonic, but then in the next chord, the C is repeated over a G chord. So the C becomes non-harmonic. The C is staying the same, so we call it a pedal tone. Hopefully you're hearing 1-5-1. Sounds very cadential. 1-6-4-5-1. But the C is the pedal tone in the bass. Listen again. And one last time. So that's a new non-chord tone discussed today so far, our very first. In measure 7, we have something familiar to us. This is an appoggiatura. Remember, appoggiatura is approached by a leap. And by the way, the leap doesn't necessarily have to be upward. It could be downward. Okay? And it resolves stepwise in the opposite direction of what the leap is. Okay, so if we're leaping up, then we're stepping down. If we're leaping down, then we're stepping up for the appoggiatura. So, measure 7, we have the appoggiatura, which in this case is approached by a leap and resolves stepwise down. And remember that appoggiaturas typically occur on the beat. Here is measure 7. One more time. And in number 8, we have a new non-chord tone to talk about. That is the escape tone. The escape tone is approached by step, then resolves by leaping, normally in the opposite direction to a chord tone. So in measure 8, I've labeled the escape tone as an E, and I've circled the note, which is D. D is our escape tone. It escapes to the D, because D is not part of that C chord, and then the escape tone resolves down by leaping. Listen again. Let me play measure 8 in its entirety so you can also hear the perfect authentic cadence. So that's our escape tone. Approached by a step, then resolves by leaping, normally in the opposite direction, to a chord tone. Now in measure 9, we have another non-chord tone that we need to talk about, and that is the cambiata. That's what CAM stands for. Cambiata. Cambiata is also changing tones. So you might see those terms used interchangeably there. So cambiata is changing tones, and we have that non-chord tone in measure 9. So let's talk a little bit more about the non-chord tones that are new today. You've already heard me mention escape tones. Let's talk a bit more about them. Escape tones essentially escape from the harmony by step, then leap in the opposite direction to freedom in the next chord. In this manner, they are a type of reverse appoggiatura. Chromatic escape tones are rarely found due to the non-stepwise resolution. So if we take a look at this example right here, we could see our escape tone, I've circled it, is the E in the treble clef in measure 1. Okay, but before we even do that, I'll play this figure right here in D major, and you can hear the escape tone labeled E, okay, that escapes from the harmony and then leaps in the opposite direction to which it escaped. So here is the escape tone. Listen again. One last time. And here is the 3-measure progression in 2/4. Also in D major, you'll hear me go 1, 5, 1, 5, 1, and you'll listen for the escape tone right in measure 1, beat 1. Here we go. Listen for the escape tone again. Okay, so this next type of non-chord tone we've already talked about, changing tones. That should sound familiar. Also called the cambiata. Also called neighbor group tones. So if you see those 3 characterizations we're talking about, they all mean the same thing. Changing tones, neighbor group tones, or cambiata. Okay, so here in parentheses in this figure we have the B and the G. Remember that the changing tone or cambiata, or now we know it to be the neighbor group tones, are a pair of notes separated by the interval of a third, okay, that are not part of the chord. They are approached by a step, as they are in this case, and resolved by a step. So let's listen to this. Listen again. One last time. Let's read together where it says neighbor group tones. Remember, sometimes referred to as changing tones, or now we know cambiata, consist of 2 notes, one a scale degree above and one a scale degree below the primary tone. Like neighboring tones, they are used to provide rhythmic interest between common tones. In this type of non-chord tone, either of the 2 neighboring tones may come first and is followed by the other before resolving back to the initial tone from which they left. So in other words, it doesn't have to be the order of B to G, it could be G to B. It's still going to be approached by step if I do it that way. So here's what's written. This would also be cambiata or changing tone or neighbor group. I just simply reversed the order of the B and the G there. If you recall from earlier, I mentioned to you the non-chord tone pedal tone. Well, pedal tone is also known as pedal point. Sometimes you'll see pedal tone, sometimes you'll see pedal point. A pedal point or pedal tone is unique among the non-chord tones in that it begins on a consonant. Here in this example, obviously I have a C minor triad. And it sustains or repeats through other chords as dissonance until the harmony, not the non-chord tone, resolves back to a consonant. It's often used in the bass as a device to strengthen a final cadence. A pedal point has a strong tonal effect, pulling the harmony back to its root. When a pedal point or pedal tone occurs in a voice other than the bass, it is usually referred to as an inverted pedal point. So let's listen to this example, the small figure in D major. First, here's our pedal point or pedal tone. This 4-measure example in C minor is a better example. Listen to the pedal tone as the harmonies change in the treble clef. I can change the rhythm of that C, the pedal tone, if I wanted to. As long as I stay on the C, it's still going to be called a pedal point or a pedal tone as it passes through other harmonies that will be dissonant with that against that C. Let's take a listen if I changed the rhythmic C to something like this. Here we go. So here's a great chart which pretty much sums up non-chord tones, non-harmonic tones. So remember, a non-harmonic tone or a non-chord tone is a note or notes that do not fit into a chord. We classify them as non-harmonic tones or non-chord tones by how they are approached and resolved. So here we have a list of our non-chord tones with the abbreviation and the approach and the resolution, and then any special notes about the non-chord tone, followed by a little musical example. So let's review. A passing tone, abbreviated PT, is approached by a step and resolved by a step. Special notes for passing tone: it resolves by continuing in the same direction as the approach, as in the example. If you look carefully at the music, where the star is, the white star, that is indeed our non-chord tone of the passing tone. In our next one, we have a neighboring tone. Abbreviated NT is approached by a step and resolved by a step. Special notes for the neighboring tone: it resolves by returning to the note preceding the non-harmonic tone. As in the musical example, the B would be the neighboring tone. Let's listen. Once more. The appoggiatura, abbreviated APP, is approached by a leap and resolved by a step. Special notes for the appoggiatura: resolves in the opposite direction from the approach. Here is an example of an appoggiatura. It's the F. Let's take a listen. Once more. Next up is our escape tone. Escape tone is abbreviated ET. It's approached by a step and resolved by a leap. Special notes for the escape tone: it resolves in the opposite direction from the approach. In this musical example, the B is the escape tone. Let's listen. Again. Our next non-chord tone has several names. We know them as changing tones, neighbor group, or cambiata. abbreviated CT or CAM if you're going with cambiata, or N.GR if you're going with neighbor group. It's approached anyway and resolved by a step. This non-chord tone involves two non-harmonic tones on either side of the note of resolution. The interval is that of a third. Where the white star is in the musical example is where the changing tone or cambiata or neighbor group occurs. Two notes, the D and the B. Let's take a listen. Listen again. And once more. Next, we have an anticipation, abbreviated ANT. Anticipation is approached anyway and resolved in a common tone. Special notes for the anticipation. Anticipation is chord tone played before the rest of the chord arrives. Remember, the tone gets there early. As in the musical example, the A is going to be the anticipation. It's a preview of what the next chord will sound like. Here is the anticipation example. Listen again. And one last time. Our next non-chord tone is the suspension, labeled SUS, sometimes SUSP, is approached by a common tone and resolved by a step. Special notes for the suspension. Suspensions are notes held over from a previous chord and resolved down. In the musical example, the B, where the star is the suspended non-chord tone. Let's take a listen. Once more. And one last time. The next one, retardation, abbreviated RET, is approached with a common tone and resolved by a step. Special notes for the retardation. Retardation are non-chord tones where a note is held over from a previous chord and resolves up. Keyword up. As in the musical example, we have the D as our retardation non-harmonic tone. Let's take a listen to this musical example. Listen again. And one last time. Next non-chord tone is the pedal tone, abbreviated PED, approached by a common tone, resolved by a common tone. A chord tone which temporarily becomes a non-harmonic tone is going to be the pedal tone, also known as pedal point, as discussed earlier. So here in this 3-chord example, the second chord, the C, where the star is where our pedal point or pedal tone occurs in the bass. Let's take a listen to this example. Once again. One last time. And now we're going to talk a little bit more about suspensions. Suspensions are typically further identified by number. The first number represents the interval between the note of suspension and the bass. The second number represents the interval between the note of resolution and the bass. So you've probably seen some of this before, where you have a 4-3 or a 7-6 or a 9-8 or a 2-3. Those are suspensions over the bass note. So here, if we take a look at this musical example, let's observe the 4-3 suspension right here. We can see here that we can call it a 4-3 suspension. It is indeed a suspension. That's the non-chord tone right there where the blue star is. That's the B. It's a 4-3 suspension because if we look at the bass note, we see an F. A fourth above F is B. That's where we get the 4 from. And then it resolves to a third above the F. So that's why this type of suspension is called a 4-3 suspension. Let's listen to this 4-3 suspension. We have a 7-6 suspension in our next example. We can call that a 7-6 suspension because if you look carefully, the bass note is a B and a seventh above the B is an A that resolves to a G, which is a sixth above the B. So that's going to be called a 7-6 suspension. Let's check this one out. Again. And one last time. Moving along, we have a 9-8 suspension. It's called a 9-8 suspension because the interval is that of a ninth above the bass note, which happens to be A. And it goes a ninth all the way above, it's a compound interval, it goes all the way above the A, up to a B, resolving to 8 above the bass, which is doubling the octave. So here is our 9-8 suspension progression. Listen again. And one last time. I wanted to show you this example. This is from one of Bach's chorales. And I wanted to show you specifically because if you look at the figured bass, you can see that we have some suspensions that if we were going to have to write in the voices for this chorale, we'd have to provide a 7-sharp-6 suspension and a 4-3 suspension at the end. So you might come across that where you see the 7-6 or the 4-3, and when it's written that way, we're talking about non-chord tones, specifically suspensions. They don't write those numbers one on top of the other so as not to be confused by the other figured bass that you see there, the 6, the 4-2, the 6-5. They'll usually typically write a dash in between that. That's an indicator that we have to write some suspensions. So if you look carefully at chord 3, we have a 7-6 sharp suspension. And that's because the bass note is an A, and a seventh above that is a G. There's where the suspension is. And that resolves to the sharp 6 above A, which happens to be F sharp. In the second measure, the last chord, number 7, we have what appears to be a 1 chord, C, C, G, but we have 4-3, which means we have to go a fourth above the bass, which happens to be an F, and then the -3 means resolve that suspended F down to the third above the bass, which is an E. So let's take a listen to this chorale, and hopefully you can hear the 7-sharp-6 suspension and the 4-3 suspension at the end. Let's listen one more time. In this example, in the key of G minor, we see that we have a 4-3 suspension in the alto and a 7-6 suspension in the tenor. We also have an escape tone. Remember, escape tones are approached by step, then resolves by leaping, typically in the opposite direction, to a chord tone. So the escape tone occurs in the soprano, 4-3 suspension in the alto, and 7-6 suspension in the tenor. Let's take a listen to this harmonic progression in the key of G minor, which will consist of the minor 1 to the major 5 to the 4-6 to the 5, ending on a half cadence. So here's G minor. Here's the progression. Listen to it again. Here we have some more suspensions. We have some 7♯6 suspensions. We have some 7-6 suspensions. And then if I page down, we have some 4♯3 suspensions. So let's take a listen to the first two measures here. Okay, so we should realize that we're in D minor, opening up with a 1-6 chord. Let's listen to it again. Here's the next two measures. C major. Again. Here's our next two measures. Back to D minor. That one was a 7♯6 suspension. Do, Ti, Do. Listen again. And the last measure, C major, first inversion. Listen again. If we page down, we can see that we have some 4♯3 suspensions. D minor, opening up with a minor 1-6. Listen again. Here's a 4♯3 suspension in the key of G. Here it is again. Here's the next suspension. Listen again. And here's the last one. One more time. So AP, in conclusion, I'm going to play you, without stopping, all of these measures, and you can hear the variety of non-chord tones that we have learned and discussed. There's abbreviations, so you'll hear the passing first measure, neighbor in the second, suspension in the third, in the fourth measure, retardation, the fifth measure, we have an appoggiatura, the sixth measure will be an escape tone, the seventh measure will be our cambiata or changing tone or neighbor group, the eighth measure will have that anticipation, and in the last measure we'll have the pedal. So let's take a listen to all of these. I'm going to play it slowly. Here it is. And I'll play it again. Passing, neighbor, suspension, retardation, appoggiatura, escape, neighbor group, cambiata changing tone, anticipation, pedal. Thanks so much for watching, AP. Make it a great day.